which finally comes right at the end, you know. So I must say that I want to first of all express my gratitude, and also on behalf of my wife, for both the bank and the university for having made us feel so welcome here. I particularly want to congratulate the university for two things. One is we spent some time in the university, including this morning at the Shri Center, which does a lot of very cutting-edge research involving nanoparticles and things like that, which I don't fully understand, but I understand enough that I should be quite impressed with what they're doing. And I think it's really extraordinary that work of that quality is being done not in a metro kind of location, but in a little bit further away. That's a great achievement, and Shastra University has every reason to feel proud. You know, in a broader intellectual sense, I'm particularly pleased that the university bought up the home in which Srinivas Ramanujan lived. He is, at least not just for my generation, but really for all Indians, quite an amazing example of what is possible in India, and I'm really glad that the university bought that home. I think I was told that the home had been modernized, so they've demodernized it and restored it to its original condition. And I think it's a great demonstration for all our children and future generations that it is from these relatively humble origins that we produce someone who is widely regarded as probably of the 20th century the greatest mathematician. And that's what mathematicians say, not just people like me. And the fact that we now know where he lived and children can come there and look at the home is a great, great achievement. My wife and I have just seen the museum upstairs, which is also a wonderfully sort of collected and curated presentation of things that evoke most of the stories that people may have heard about Ramanujan. It's a great museum, and sir, you and the university deserve everyone's congratulations for immortalizing it. You know, I was particularly struck during the visit because opposite the home was a series of small shops, one of which sells buckets and pails and other utensils. So I asked them, do you think they know who lived here? So we went at random and asked one of the people, and of course they all knew that this is the home of S. Ramanujan, a great mathematician. And you know, to have made people in ordinary circumstances in a small town aware that they are living in what is actually a part of India's intellectual heritage is an extraordinary achievement, for which many, many congratulations and thanks. Now, as Dr. Subramaniam pointed out, we are slightly altering the subject of this lecture. No, not completely. The lecture was India's role in the global financial architecture, but I'm just converting it into a lecture on sort of the globe and India and the globe. So we're going to talk a little bit about India because what's happening right now is quite important. You know, until about the global financial crisis, there was a tremendous optimism about what was happening in India, because really India's growth rate suddenly had shot up. And after a long period when our growth was actually quite modest, I would say that roughly, if you look at the 60s and the 70s, our growth rate was about 3.5%. And for 3.5% with population growth at 2.2%, that really means that per capita income grows at less than 1.5%. During the 80s and the 90s, as a result of many changes that were made in economic policy, and especially in the 90s, the growth rate picked up to about 5.7% on average. So population was growing at 2, so really the per capita went to 3.7. And you know, in the 90s, we did a lot of reforms, but the reforms didn't immediately have an impact on growth. So actually the growth rate of the 90s was not very different from the growth rate of the 80s. So there was a lot of debate there that, you know, what are all these reforms? They're not doing anything much more than the 80s, and huge amount of discussion. But of course, you know, our view has always been that we, for a variety of reasons, did these reforms very gradually. Now, people can debate that. I do believe that in a large, diverse, and highly democratic country, you cannot really turn on a pin. When you're thinking of making changes, you do need to have a lot of discussion, bring a whole lot of people along, and therefore it just takes time. But one consequence of taking time is that the beneficial effect of the reforms also take time. And I think that's what happened in our case, because in the 2000s, the growth rate shot up again. So 5.7 in the 80s and 90s. In the decade of the 2000s, there was actually a 5-year period when the average growth rate went to 9%, just before the economic crisis of 2008. And this led the world and also India to come to the conclusion that, right, we've taken off. And after all, if the Chinese can do it, why can't we? And a great deal of optimism. The government was being criticized all the time that, yes, you're getting growth, but it's not helping the poor and so on. And we were marshalling a lot of data to show that, look, that's not totally true. In fact, the growth is quite inclusive. But nobody actually doubted that the growth was taking place. Then the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, which is usually called the Lehman Brothers crisis, which occurred in 2008, that led to a sudden hold. And in 2008, 2009, the growth rate of the economy came down to about 6.3%. We then used a fiscal stimulus that helped. And in 2009, 2010, it shot up to 8 plus, and 2010, 2011, it actually shot up to 9.3%. So not only had we done well before 2008, but we appeared to have managed the Lehman Brothers crisis extremely well. Then the global economy hit a second crisis, and that is what is commonly called the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis of 2011. Again, we were hit, and our growth rate went down to about 6.3% in 2011-12. You know, initially, it might have looked that, okay, so we had the Lehman Brothers crisis, we got hit, we recovered. Now we have the sovereign debt crisis, we've got hit, we'll recover. But this time, that's not what happened. Because in 2011, 2012, our growth rate dipped to 6.3. In 2012, 2013, it dipped again to 5%. And this year, which is 2013-14, the chances are that it will be again around 5%. Basically, in the first half of the current year, it's actually lower than 5%. There is a hope that in the second half it will get better. You've heard the finance minister make that statement, and I think that there's a chance that in the second half it will be better. But you know, if you look at the period as a whole, after the Eurozone crisis of 2011, we will have gone down to 6.3, 5, and then we have to ask ourselves, what will 2014-15 be? And this is where I want to just take a break and make one point, that, you know, I think we are not actually used to the fact that we have become much more globally integrated. And we cannot chart a course for India which is completely independent of what happens in the rest of the world. What this means is that when we were growing at 9%, we were benefiting from a global boom because everybody was doing well. And when everybody is not doing well, we also go down. That doesn't mean, by the way, that our current problems are only because of what has happened in the global economy. I think the government has been very, very clear that yes, the global slowdown would have had an impact. But I think there are some domestic problems that have also come up, and I think we need to address them. Raghuram Rajan, speaking a couple of weeks ago, made the following statement. He said, I think 1/3 of our slowdown is due to the global factors and 2/3 is due to domestic factors. I think that's broadly not a bad judgment. If you look at the long-term growth rate over the last 10 years and you apply sort of statistical filters, for those of you who do economics, something like the Hodrick-Prescott filter, to work out that if you strip the global boom effect, what is the underlying growth of India? Well, the underlying growth then turns out to be about 7.4%, not 8 and 9, which, depending on which period you choose, you can come up with. So the real issue is that what Raghu's view would be, that 7.5 has come down to 5. That's a drop of maybe 2.5 percentage points, and 1/3 of that is due to the global factors, which means that if there had been no domestic problem, we probably would have slowed down to around 6.7, 6.8 anyway. And the reason we've gone to 5 is because of domestic problems. Now, what are those domestic problems? I think that's been talked about a lot, and I won't go into it in detail, but if somebody wants to raise it during the question session, I'm happy to elaborate. Basically, whenever an economy moves rapidly, not everything moves at the pace needed to support that growth. And sooner or later, these other domestic constraints begin to surface. And I think that's really what has happened in India. Let me just give you one example of the kind of problem that we faced. I'm going to focus specifically on the power situation. I'm, after all, speaking in Tamil Nadu, and I know that in Tamil Nadu economy, the power situation is extremely important. It's also important for the Indian position. And for many years, we have been following a policy of trying to increase investment in the power sector. And the focus of a lot of that effort was to increase investment in generating capacity. I mean, if you want more power, you have to have more generating capacity. And we have been remarkably successful in setting up new generating plants. Let me just give you one example. In the year 2012-13, the year that is the previous financial year, which is actually also the first year of the 12th plan, we added something like 21,000 megawatts of generating capacity. In the whole of the 11th plan, the previous 5 years, we added 21,000 megawatts of generating capacity. This was the result of a conscious policy which opened up investment in power to the private sector, and half the generating capacity is really from the private sector. Some of it is captive and so on. Now, while we did extremely well in generation, we didn't do nearly as well in increasing the supply of fuel, both coal and also gas. And the lack of fuel for these plants really created a problem. Many banks, and I think City Union Bank has its own perspective on this, but many banks had financed these projects in the old belief that, things will come out all right, and many of them didn't even have fuel supply agreements. Now, we were running an economy in which Coal India didn't actually ever think that it needed to give what are legally binding fuel supply agreements. They would be letters of understanding, some informal linkage, etc., but not a legally binding fuel supply agreement. And a modern economy, particularly an economy where you have private sector investments, which are being financed by bankers, some bankers being foreign and some domestic, they do require legally enforceable fuel supply agreements. And it was extremely difficult to solve this problem, primarily because, on the one hand, coal is a tradable commodity. One view could be that if you don't have domestic coal, there's some delay in domestic supplies. Of course, you have to work to solve those problems, but why should the power generators suffer because they can import the coal? And the reason that couldn't happen in the Indian situation is our domestic coal is heavily underpriced compared to imported coal. So imported coal was available, but the economics and the expectation of power sector producers was such